Reportedly, the Golden State Warriors don't want to trade for Brandon Ingram. I'll explain why that is and what it means for Ingram's trade market. Plus, should the Pels go after Chris Paul in a different deal? It's a Monday episode of Locked On Pelicans. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pelicans, your daily New Orleans Pelicans podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to another edition of Locked On Pelicans, the daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Pelicans at NBA, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, available wherever you get your podcasts and available on YouTube. I'm your host, Pelicans Insider, credential member of the media, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter. Here with y'all on this Monday, we are kicking off another week's worth of podcasts here. And of course, we are going to talk about another Brandon Ingram deal, but this time not happening with the Golden State Warriors and why that is. Is it concerning or is it just leverage? Then let's look at Chris Paul and how the Pelicans could acquire him to put him on this team. And then a couple of expectations going forward with what the draft might look like, free agency, and getting deals done. So, of course, thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs, which helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So let's just jump into it. This was the reporting via Anthony Slater over the weekend that the Golden State Warriors are not interested in Brandon Ingram. And this comes literally on the heels of a report saying they want to get a scoring wing to pair with Steph Curry. Maybe they're going to do something with Klay Thompson, but they need a scoring wing, but not Brandon Ingram. Hold on here, right? Which is a little confusing when you think about it. That's very strange because Ingram at 26 can still score. And if you're looking for a scoring wing, that's your guy to go and get. So why don't they want him? And after talking to a couple Warriors people about this, and we'll look at potential trades here in a second too, that, part of it is his lack of three-point shooting for a team that likes to shoot threes. That is their identity, where they want to go with space and pace. That's just not how Brandon Ingram tends to play, right? The lack of three-point shooting is a big reason why we're kind of frustrated with him here in New Orleans as well. So you have that, and then it's the looming deal of what are you going to pay him? He's here for one more year, so if you trade for him, you kind of just assume that you're going to give him a big extension, and for someone who just doesn't really fit what the Warriors kind of do, what their culture is, the style of ball that they play, I don't think that's something they're really intrigued by. There's reports that they want to go after Jimmy Butler instead of Brandon Ingram, and when you look at their ages, and Jimmy Butler is maybe at their peaks, a better player, but he is significantly older. There's also on the Warriors side of this, an interest in cutting some money. One of the things we've talked a lot about is the second apron. There's a first apron, there's a second apron, and before those, there's also the luxury tax threshold. This all works around the salary cap. And maybe later in the week, we'll kind of explain what that is and why teams are trying to kind of duck under it. But essentially, once you go into the luxury tax, you're paying more money. Then when you hit the first apron, you have restrictions on what you're allowed to trade and guys that you're allowed to sign and how much more money you can spend. And then when you get even further in terms of payroll to the second apron, there's even more restrictions where you basically just can't do much to your team. So one of the things that I've been looking at, and then I've talked about on our Locked On NBA podcast as well, which I host on Wednesdays, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, that second apron teams have like a shelf life of like 2 years, maybe 3, if that, before basically like you just can't be good. You're paying so much money that you may as well let some of those players go and kind of trade them off. The Boston Celtics are a good example. The second that Jaylen Brown signed that extension, basically meant that there's a clock ticking and they got to win a title right now because they're going to blow that team up and go through a rebuild eventually. The Warriors are one of them. The Phoenix Suns are one of them too. Those are the type of teams that you're looking at. Even the Minnesota Timberwolves, when we talked about Karl Anthony Towns, because why would they trade him? Is because of the second apron, and they're going to be pushing that, which limits what you can do. It basically makes title windows really, really short for your core group of guys. So the Warriors know that, Adding Brandon Ingram and his salary onto their books doesn't really help them with that. I do like the idea, though, of the Warriors as a trade partner. I think any deal would be built around Brandon Ingram going out and then Andrew Wiggins coming back. Wiggins isn't nearly as good of a scorer as Brandon Ingram is, but this is a guy who kind of has some championship experience and has done well. He played 71 games, was away from the team for a little bit too. 13.2 points per game, 4.5 rebounds, and he shoots the three ball relatively well, right around 36%. And at times he's done it on volume. 2 years ago, he shot almost 40% and had 6 attempts per game. So this is a guy that could be a useful player. He's a very good defender too, kind of fits in with what New Orleans wants. Again, not as elite of a scorer overall as Brandon Ingram, but you could also get back a guy potentially like Jonathan Kuminga, who's got 1 year left. He's going to be due for an extension, so the Warriors are going to have to pay him or not. Started a number of games for the Warriors this past year, 46 of them, 16.1 points per game. He doesn't really have a significant three-point shot, 34% for his career last year on just over 2 attempts per game was just 32%. But he's 21. He's a young player that's growing that they're very high on that you could always flip later if you need to. And if you could get Brandon Podziemski along with him, so it would be Kuminga, Wiggins, and Podziemski, I think that could be a really good return for New Orleans. All of those guys would be in the rotation for the Pelicans. So hearing that Golden State doesn't want to be involved in this deal, it's kind of disappointing if they don't want to go after Brandon Ingram, because I think those are useful players that you would get in return. There's some depth there and room for guys to grow. And that gives you that little bit of like sustainable success that, the team kind of wants, that small markets want. So you get these guys that are young, could grow, and on cheap deals, at least for a year in terms of Kuminga. And I don't think Kuminga is going to get, a max or anything like that after his 4th year in the league. So you have the ability to grow and a little bit more flexibility with some of these guys. You could flip Wiggins later to another contender. You could just keep him, whatever it might be. His contract isn't terrible. His 3 years left. He's going to make $26.2 million this coming year. That's a lot, but it's not like the end of the world. And if you add those 3 to this team, it increases the salary a little bit, but then you have more flexibility to make other moves. And I think that would be an important thing for the Pels as well, because they still need to go and get a center. More on that in the 3rd segment of today's show. So it's a little bit disappointing that the Warriors potentially don't want to trade for Brandon Ingram, because you want his market to be as robust as possible. And it sounds like maybe that extension and his lack of threes is scaring teams off. And that also means that, hey, you might need to re-sign him. More on that in the future. There is another reason, though, why I think the Warriors might not be interested in Brandon Ingram, or at least putting it out there publicly. Let's break down what that is coming up in the next part here of Locked On Pelicans, along with getting Chris Paul, who's not in this deal for a reason, and I will tell you why. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs is the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. You don't want open positions. That's costing you money. That's putting additional stress on others. If you're a small business, margins might already be thin. You can't have those positions open for a long time. And that's good, because LinkedIn isn't just another job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals you can't find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all of that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. And over 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNBA to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is also brought to you by NOLA Star Bar. I want to invite you to NOLA Star Bar because it's right down the street from the Smoothie King Center. So next season, Go there for your pre and post game libations. They're going to have every Pelicans game home and away throughout the season on their big screen. You want to go watch the NBA Finals? It's a great spot for that as well because they have a pool table, video poker, an internet jukebox, and karaoke every Wednesday night. They feature over 100 worldwide spirits and a hefty selection of local beers. They are a true Pelicans fan bar, and they even created and produced their Pelicans anthem, Fly Pelicans Fly, complete with a music video. So join your fellow Pelicans fans at NOLA Star Bar at 212 Loyola Avenue, open 7 days a week, 6 p.m. to 4 a.m., and check out their Pelicans anthem on the NOLA Star Bar YouTube page. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast, covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans at YouTube. And do me a favor today. Tell a friend about Locked On Pelicans. We're covering the offseason, everything you want to know about potential trades, diving deep into the draft, giving you insight that you don't get anywhere else. So let's see how they're going to build this team, what it's going to look like next season, and how they're going to move forward. So tell a friend. Get them clued into Locked On Pelicans here and become an everydayer. Listen Monday through Friday. That's what it means. Now, for your second listen, don't listen to yelling, things like that aren't related to sports, right? Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the yelling. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So before we get into Chris Paul in a minute, because he's a little bit aging, and I don't know if it's the right fit, but what if you could get him for like virtually nothing? That might change things a little bit here. Let's keep with the Brandon Ingram part. It's mildly concerning to me that the Warriors, who have clearly stated a need for a scoring wing, aren't interested in the scoring wing that is Brandon Ingram. All right, so they're saying that publicly. I don't know if we need to believe that though. Right? This is the time of year of smoke screens, of where people just say a lot of stuff and it doesn't necessarily mean much unless you're the Sacramento Kings, publicly negotiating with your head coach, Mike Brown. And that was a bad look. Right now, though, things don't mean much. People are trying to throw each other off the scent of things. You're trying to drive down prices. You're trying to increase prices of players, all of that stuff. So the Warriors coming out and saying, we're not interested in Brandon Ingram. We want to cut payroll because we don't want to be a second apron team. I don't know about that. That team prints money. They have been willing to spend more than like any other team we have ever seen. And if they can do that and maybe make the playoffs again, I think they'd be interested in that. I think they're a little bit worried they haven't won a title for the past 2 years and didn't even make the postseason at all this season. But that's still a team that wants to go try and win a ring as long as they've got Steph Curry there. Brandon Ingram would give them some youth and more experience and kind of be the player they need. I don't think Kuminga's going to be as good as Ingram. But if you're getting Wiggins, Kuminga, and Podziemski back, that's a different story. So they should want Brandon Ingram. I'd also be willing to bet that they still kind of do. This is just for leverage, right? Oh, we're not interested in that player. Try and drive down the market for him. Tell other people, well, if the Warriors don't want him, why should we? And try and lower the price a little bit so that when they reach out and discuss this with the Pelicans, and that's going to happen at some point, they can at least start the negotiations way lower. The problem is I don't actually think negotiating through the media works. I don't even think it worked with with the Kings and Mike Brown, their head coach. They were just going to come to a natural agreement there, and that just didn't need to be like ugly in public for a minute. So I don't believe this. I don't believe this at all. I think they're going to be interested in Brandon Ingram. It may be as concerning if they ultimately aren't, but they're not really in position to be like, no, we don't want that guy. Certainly not that team. Jimmy Butler's not a better option for them necessarily unless they're just trying to increase their defense. But they've ranked outside of the top 8 in offense for 2 years now, and I don't think that's what they want at all when it comes to that. They might want to get better defensively, sure, but I don't think they're like actively looking to not try and improve in terms of offense and all of those things. I think that is definitely what they would like to do as well, because that's how kind of their team is built. So ultimately, I'm not too scared by this. But let's switch gears from Brandon Ingram, from Kuminga. Wiggins and others here to another player on their team that was kind of a big swing for them, and that was Chris Paul. This is the Chris Paul, right? We know who this is. We don't need to overthink Chris Paul's career here and how good he has been, and that he is, a by far first ballot Hall of Famer. But last year was a little weird with the Golden State Warriors coming off the bench a lot, playing 58 games, starting 18. That is not anything he's done. It's not the first time I'm looking at his numbers. That's the first time he's ever not started a game in his career, which is kind of wild, until last season. 9.2 points per game, 7 assists, 4 rebounds, and shot the ball pretty well from 3, 37% on 3.6 attempts. What's that come to per 36 is what we want to look at here. 12.5 points per game, 9 assists, and 5 3-point attempts. Coming off the bench, you do a whole lot worse than Chris Paul still. I love Jose Alvarado. Chris Paul is also undersized, but Chris Paul has proven it in the NBA. The assists are better. The numbers are still there. He can manipulate some of the defense still. I don't think that's fully what the Pelicans need. I think you need more creation than just passing, because Chris Paul doesn't have that kind of explosiveness like he used to. He's aging, right? The defense isn't nearly as good as it used to be. But for a useful player, like you want to call him that, like absolutely. He absolutely is. And that means if you can get him for the right price, yeah, put him on this team. There's some downsides to it, more on that in a second here. But David Griffin said at his end of season media availability that this team needed more basketball IQ. I don't know if there's a better player in the league than Chris Paul when it comes to basketball IQ. And the reunion aspect of this is nice. This is where his career started. This is where he became an MVP candidate, right? Where he kind of started to build his legacy. Sometimes you just got to do things like that, for the fans. We'd love to see him in a New Orleans uniform again, playing out there in the Smoothie King Center. That idea of kind of the bookend of his career is really great. So here's how it works. He is owed $30 million potentially next season. It's a non-guaranteed deal. It guarantees on June 8th. So before June 8th, so less than a month from now, the Warriors can keep him, pay him $30 million. They can renegotiate that a little bit, or they could waive him. And if they waive him, he can just sign for any team for any amount. You might be able to get him for the mid-level exception. $10 million a year, it's kind of $13 million a year for the Pelicans. Is that the kind of free agent move that they want to add? I don't hate that idea. I'd like to get him for cheaper than that. If you sign him to that, you're certainly paying the luxury tax, but it adds a lot of just basketball IQ, some passing, some creation off the bench to this team. And then you just get all that nice, warm, and happy stuff alongside with it, seeing him back here in New Orleans. He can also still throw lobs to Zion. Them in the pick and roll would still be pretty fun, I think. Dude's a gamer. He can go out and play, certainly. The other thing to keep in mind with this is nothing actually might happen by June 28th. What's likely going to happen as the Warriors maybe look to trade him, look to kind of figure something else out with him, they're likely going to move that date back. You can mutually agree to move those guarantee dates back. So maybe it goes into July or something like that, where they're trying to kind of figure out what they want to do. And Chris Paul's like, oh, okay, yeah, kick it down the road. A week, 2, 3, a month, who knows, who cares? Because if they guarantee him $30 million, which they're almost certainly not going to do, that makes it impossible for him to be traded. So trying to kind of figure out what to do with that gives them both the more options. And if Chris Paul knows he's not going to be back there, he kind of probably wants to pick his destination of where he wants to go. Maybe it's New Orleans, maybe it's not. One thing to keep in mind with this is I would probably only want him on a 1-year deal. I would not want to add him for much longer than that, just given some of the decline in his play. He struggled to stay healthy a little bit. We've seen this team go for aging vets, right? JJ Redick, bringing him in, and Redick was good. CJ, right, had a good season last year, but there's some concern about his contract long-term and the way his game is aging a little bit too. You don't want to bring in long-term salary for an aging player that's likely going to decline a good bit. So you want to sign him to a 1-year deal. If you could get him for 1 year, $13 million, would you do that? Let me know in the comments down below on YouTube. So I said that June 28th date, and they could kick that down the road a little bit. They could mutually agree to kind of delay that, extend it out a little bit. That's important. That's important for trying to figure out what this team's going to do this offseason. Let's talk about that, kind of the expectations with certain parts of it. That's coming up here next in today's episode of Locked On Pelicans. Today's episode of Locked On Pelicans is brought to you by eBay Motors, my favorite. And I love eBay Motors because they keep my cars on the road. I got my daily driver Jeep. It's running great. I've added a ton of stuff to it. It's a Jeep. That's what you do. Get all my parts and everything I want at eBay Motors. It's not just parts, right? Sometimes you just want to put in LED headlights, be able to see at night better. You want to throw a roof rack on your vehicle. I wouldn't call it a part, but you want accessories, different things like that. eBay Motors has it. But I also use them for parts. Right now, it's hot in Louisiana, and on the old Corvette, I'm trying to redo the AC so I can drive around in it over the summer. It's coming along nicely. I'm getting all the parts from eBay Motors. I'm going to be cruising around cool in that car because of eBay Motors. So whether you're into speed, power, style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your vehicle, you're always going to find exactly what you're looking for. And my favorite part with the eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. I've ordered from other places before. You get the part in, it doesn't fit your vehicle. Now you got to send it back, get another one, and now your vehicle's not running. And that's not an ideal situation. And their prices are great. With eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. So with all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home a huge win. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. And thank you for making Locked On Pelicans your first listen today and every day. We're here Monday through Friday, the #1 Pelicans podcast covering everything you want to know about this Pelicans team. All the stuff you need, that's what we cover here. So please subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Join over 10,000 Pelicans fans on YouTube as well. And become an everydayer. That means you are listening to Locked On Pelicans Monday through Friday. So we're going to start to wrap up the show here. Before that, though, your second listen, Ross Jackson, host of the Locked On Saints podcast. Saw him this weekend. It was great. Dude is awesome. No one's better than at covering the Saints than him, giving you everything you need, just like here on Locked On Pelicans. We actually even talked about some crossover shows between Locked On Pelicans and Locked On Saints that we're going to do, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So we're looking forward to all of that. So Ross Jackson, everything you need to get your black and gold fix over at the Locked On Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Make that your second listen today. So we just talked about the Chris Paul guaranteed by date, June 28th. It's the end of this month, right? That kind of coincides with free agency a little bit, all of those things. You know, we're wondering when Brandon Ingram's going to get traded. And, you know, if you read Mark Stein's Substack, the email newsletter he sends out, he thinks it's more of like a certainty than just a possibility that Ingram gets traded. So when's it going to get done? Why hasn't a deal gotten done? There's no reason to get a deal done yet. No team makes trades during this time that are significant. And as I've gone back and looked at other deals, other kind of blockbuster, shocking trades, things like that, a lot of these deals don't get done when you think they would. And that doesn't mean that there's a bad market or anything like that. I go back to the trade with Donovan Mitchell going from the Jazz to the Cleveland Cavaliers, right? That happened in September, about a month before training camp. That's probably the timing that you're looking for a deal. So if this drags out into the summer and you hear negotiations aren't going well between Brandon Ingram and the Pelicans, that's okay. I still think they wouldn't mind bringing him back and seeing what a new starting center would do. They've kind of hinted at that. They've just got to bring him back at the right price. That to me just kind of says that you're not going to see something happen right away, nor necessarily should they. They shouldn't just trade Brandon Ingram to trade Brandon Ingram. You're trading him because you want to get the correct deal done, the deal that is going to make you the best team possible. And if that doesn't exist, well, it feels like they definitely need a big shakeup, and that likely means moving Brandon Ingram. You still are probably looking to, improve your team. And if you can't do that, you can't do it. Now, deals often get done around the start of free agency. July 6th was when the Utah Jazz traded Rudy Gobert, when they basically blew that whole team up, right? So those are the type of things that you need to look at. These deals could get done at any time. So it's not necessarily, I'm trying to pull one or two other ones that I can think of at the top of my head that were kind of like, whoa, that deal just got done. If we look at Jimmy Butler, and let's look at when Bradley Beal was traded as well. Because that was kind of like I can't even remember, to be perfectly honest, when that one got done. And I'm doing this in the moment, and I probably should have not done that. Weird. I pulled up the Wizards. He's not on there. He's traded from the Wizards. I was like, why can't I find him on Basketball Reference to see when it gets done? So this is what I get for not doing prep work ahead of time and finding where these are, because I'm just trying to spin the wheels waiting for pages to load with the internet here. Okay, Bradley Beal was traded on June 23rd. So that one happened earlier to the Phoenix Suns, so before the draft. So draft picks involved in that. Jimmy Butler's been dealt a couple of times. So let's see when his deals were done, because he's kind of forced his way out of teams. So June 22nd, the Bulls traded him to Minnesota. And then he was traded to the Philadelphia 76ers November 12th of 2018. So that's a little bit interesting as well. And then he was traded to the Miami Heat, which was a free agency deal, really. It felt like, with the 76ers. Signed as a free, it was a sign and trade. Yeah. So it was free agency. So July 6th. So these deals can happen at any time. So kind of going on that, they do tend to happen a little bit sooner, but some tend to go later. And given how weird Brandon Ingram's trade market looks like it could be, it feels like that's kind of what we're looking at. I think it'll be a later deal, but deadlines are when things get done in the NBA. Deadlines are when things get done in the NBA, especially if draft picks are involved. And it feels like they'll be involved here, and you want to make sure you draft the right guy. But as we talked about in Friday's show, it's a weaker draft. I'm going to sneeze again. It's a weaker draft. So if you're not interested in these draft picks or drafting a guy in this draft, it easily could mean that a deal drags out because they're not as important in this sort of thing. So that might be why. If it was a better draft, I think you would for sure see a deal done the week before the draft, a couple days before the draft. But because it's that weaker draft and likely going to involve future picks, that's not as necessary, this time around when it comes to a trade. But we'll see. We're still expecting him to be moved. Where it's going to end up, who knows? Maybe not the Warriors, though I still think they're going to be interested in Brandon Ingram. Again, what's your ideal Brandon Ingram trade? Let me know in the comments down below on YouTube. So that's going to do it for this episode of Locked On Pelicans. I appreciate y'all so much for listening. I will be on the Locked On Kings podcast talking about a Brandon Ingram trade and what that could look like. We'll probably talk about the Kings on Thursday here on Locked On Pelicans when we do Trade Target Thursday. So I'm looking forward to going on that, kind of understanding their interest in Brandon Ingram a little bit more. So as always, I'm your host, Jake Madison, at NOLA Jake on Twitter, and I'll be back with you all tomorrow. We're going to talk a little bit NBA Finals, but what the Pelicans can learn from the NBA Finals that are starting. And there's definitely some things to take away from that. I'm looking forward to that show. That's going to be tomorrow's episode of Locked On Pelicans, and I'll see y'all then.